Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. So this week, the world lost an impressive, influential figure, Pope Francis, the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. And being the rabbi of 3,000 Jews, I can't even imagine what that job is like. Possibly easier. He had a much bigger clothing budget than I do. But I want to share some thoughts about what perhaps we might be thinking, what it might mean at this moment, and even perhaps drawing from the wisdom of the Torah from Parshat Shmini that we read today. And so in some sense, Shmini is the perfect portion to reflect on this moment in history, because it is about the loss of religious leaders, in this case Nadav and Avihu offering strange fire, and how the world responds to the loss of the death of religious leaders, and also about the appointment of new ones, about how Aaron and his sons move on and how the priesthood continues. And by the way, it's particularly appropriate because in the world today, there is probably no other role which is as similar in its pomp, in its circumstance, and its theological implications as that of the Pope to the high priest. Because in Judaism, we say that there are now the Kohanim, they get called up first, they bless us, but really we are now responsible for our own relationship with God. Whereas the role in Christianity, in Catholicism, of the Pope as intercessor, as standing between his people and God, and saying prayers and rituals that no one else can say, is actually the closest thing to perhaps what we had when we had a high priest thousands of years ago. And so I want to really share two ideas today. One is to reflect on what this means for our neighbors and how we as Jews, and there may be those in this room as well who are experiencing at this moment this loss, and how we can relate to our neighbors as they experience this loss. And then I also want to take a few moments to talk about what this moment means for Jews, for those of us in this room who are wondering what happens next. So from our portion this week, we can draw some wisdom what to do and what not to do when there is a communal loss and how we respond. And so it is possible when a community suffers in a loss to come with a place of judgment or to come with the types of consolation that are not helpful. So for example, Moses says to Aaron after this death, "Bekrovai akadesh." Oh, it was just what was meant to. These things just happened. What are you going to do? That's how God works, which was not particularly comforting for Aaron and his remaining sons. And then God comes to Aaron and says, the next thing God says is, and this is actually the first time he talks to Aaron alone directly in the entire Bible, "Drink no wine or other intoxicant, yain v'shechar al tesht," right? "You or your sons as you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die." So some people conclude from this that perhaps that is what Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's sons, did wrong, since the first thing God says is don't drink and daven, that therefore that is what they did that caused them to die. And so when we are with someone who suffers a loss, sometimes looking for reasons is not particularly helpful or consoling. The other thing is, our tradition says that we have to allow people space to grieve. So in Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, "Al taratzet chavercha b'shtat ka'aso, ve'al tenachamenu b'sha'ah shemeto mutal lefanav." He says, don't try to soothe your friend when he is in the midst of his rage, and don't comfort him when his dead is still laid out before him. That basically, until you get to the funeral, there is a point at which it is still too soon to offer consolation. There's a point where it's still too soon to attempt to offer comfort. The pain is still too raw, and you can be present, but don't try to say it's going to be okay, because it will, but you can't say it yet. And the third bit of advice that I think our tradition gives, is so after Aaron and Aaron's sons die, Aaron is supposed to eat of the sin offering, and he does not. He's lost his appetite. And Moses, seir hachatat darosh darash Moshe. Moses comes and seeks out Aaron. Why didn't you eat the sin offering that you were supposed to eat? And Aaron says, I have had enough offerings today. And so that when someone goes through a loss, that it is not for us to judge whether their ritual performance is correct. Well, at Shiva, they didn't cover all the mirrors, that really to kind of be able to take a step back and appreciate that they're going through this journey in the way that they are going through it. And so as we encounter neighbors, friends for whom this is a generational loss, this is an international loss, to be able to ask thoughtful questions, but to also give space to offer condolences in a helpful way is very appropriate. And so, in fact, someone shared with me the funeral was actually this morning in Rome, the procession from the Vatican to a church just a few miles away where many of the popes are buried. And I want to reflect on what this might mean for us as Jews. And so first of all, I just want to say that it is a little bit remarkable that a rabbi can stand on the bima of a synagogue and have nice things to say about the Pope. Now, some of my predecessors may also have stood on the bima and said nice things about the Pope, but that was only because there was an inquisitor standing right behind them. Because really, for most of the millennia, the 2 millennia of its existence, the Catholic Church was one of the most fierce drivers of anti-Semitism in its theology, in its teachings, in its liturgy, and much of the hatred of Jews in the world today comes from the teachings of the Church. And yet, in the last decades, there has been a shift, there has been a change. And here is where I actually need to pause and make an admission, which is that I actually already gave this sermon once. So I started working on this sermon. I'm like, this sounds familiar. And it turns out that 20 years ago, Pope John Paul II passed away, Parshat Shmini. And so I already had a sermon in the closet, in the files, on what happens if the Pope dies on Parshat Shmini. How often, right? So actually, it's maybe not that my sermons repeat. Maybe it's that history has started repeating itself. But, so I'll reflect back what I said 20 years ago, that when he became Pope in 1978, that he was, up to that time, I think the most conscious of his relationship with Jews. He was one of the first popes, if not the first, to refer to Judaism as Catholicism's elder brother. And one of his very first visits was to his native Poland, but he visited Auschwitz, where he prayed for the victims of the Holocaust and begged forgiveness for Christianity's role in that disaster. And then in 1986, he became the first pope that we know of to visit a synagogue. He visited the great synagogue in Rome. They sat together before the ark, and they had a nice chat. He condemned anti-Semitism, and he said Christians, Catholics in particular, should perform tshuva, and he used that word, repentance, for the hatred that had laid the path for the Holocaust. Now, the pope that followed, Benedict XVI, started out on the same path. He visited synagogues in Cologne. He visited synagogues in New York. But he had a complicated legacy because he also brought back into the fold, de-excommunicated, recommunicated some bishops who had strongly anti-Semitic views, who rejected dialogue with Jews, and re-permitted something called the Tridentine Mass. Now, this is not Mass where you chew gum 3 times. This is a Mass that includes a prayer that all Jews convert to Christianity, And so after the uproar about that, he kind of changed the language, he kind of hedged a little bit. But now 20 years later, here we are, and we are 3 popes into this new era, if you will, or to be fair, even Vatican II in the 1960s began this trend. And Pope Francis was a unique pope. He was the first pope from South America. He had a reputation for being a little bit like Esti, like a very common sense sort of person, very down to earth, kind of didn't want all the frippery that went along. He cared about the common people. He chose a name. There had never been, usually popes, it's like a sequel, right? Pope Leo the this, John Paul II. He was the first Francis because he saw Francis as his model of what a pope should be, and Francis being someone who was engaged with the common folk. And here's the thing, he actually cared about Jews before it was cool. So when he was still just a cardinal, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, he was in Buenos Aires, and he attended Rosh Hashanah services at the B'nai Tikva synagogue in 2007. And actually, he was friendly with one of the main rabbis in Buenos Aires, Rabbi Abraham Skorka. They wrote a book together called On Heaven and Earth. And so here is where I think he theologically took perhaps a different turn even than his predecessors. So both Benedict and John Paul visited Auschwitz, which is recognizing Jewish victimhood, which is saying, okay, we're sorry, bad things happened under our watch to Jews. In 2014, Francis visited the grave of Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism. And this is particularly significant because 100 years before, Herzl had gone to visit Pope Pius X and said, will you give your blessing to Zionism? Will you say that it is okay in Christian theology for Jews to go back to the land of Israel? Now, look, we don't really need his permission, but it would have helped. And Pius said, we cannot give approval to this movement. We can't prevent it, but we could never sanction it. The soul of Jerusalem has been sanctified by our Lord, and as the head of the church, I cannot tell you anything different. And until the Jews recognize Jesus, we cannot recognize them. And so for his successor, a century later, Francis, to come to the grave of Herzl, is to say not just we recognize that the Jews are victims and we're sorry, but no, the Jews are actually a people like any other, and we have to relate to them as such. With all of that being said, the last 18 months have been tough in our relationship with Pope Francis, because on the one hand, he condemned the October 7th attacks, he granted audiences to Israeli hostage families and freed hostages, but he also reached out and used language about Palestinians and their struggle that many of us felt were over the line. So he never said it publicly, but there were those who felt that he, at least in private, accused Israel of genocide. And so the feelings between Jews and Pope Francis have been complicated for this last 18 months. And so the Israeli government actually tweeted condolences on his death and then deleted the tweet, which is not a classy move. And by the way, they offered condolences on the death of Jimmy Carter, who was also not a great friend. And so the funeral this morning, the United States sent high-level representatives, our president and others. Many world leaders were there. Israel sent the undersecretary for maintenance or something. It was like a very low-level person. And the argument was, well, it was Shabbat, and we would have to spend Shabbat in Rome. I've spent Shabbat in Rome. It's lovely. There's a great kosher restaurant. They serve a great dinner. I mean, it really would have been fine. And so I think we are wrestling still with our complicated relationship with someone who did a lot to advance our relationship between Jews and Catholics, but also injected a different kind of complexity. So what happens now? In a few days, there will be a conclave. So it's not exactly like the movie, if you saw it, Although the marketing guys for that movie should definitely show an alibi for where they were last weekend, I'm just saying. And the jockeying has begun. Now, by the way, one of the candidates is a guy who I've met, Pier Battista Pizzabella, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. And Pope Francis made him a cardinal in 2023, which is actually unique because he is the cardinal who oversees Jerusalem and many other parts of the land of Israel and beyond. And I was with a delegation of rabbis who met with him last spring. And he was very gracious. He gave us engraved pens made of olive wood. His people gave us the only coffee I've ever liked. And I have a lot of respect for him. He spoke very openly about where he is. He had actually offered himself up in exchange for the hostages. And the Middle East is a tough place to be a Christian right now. Now, he's got, to be fair, he's really on the outside track. I mean, he's got a better shot than Stanley Tucci or John Lithgow. I won't spoil the movie for you. But it's an interesting time ahead. So as we look at this moment in history, a moment where 1.4 billion of our neighbors are in mourning and are wondering what is the direction of their faith going to be? Where is their next leader going to take them? And we wonder that too, because it's not only about us, but it is also about us, because every branch, every flavor of Christianity ultimately has its base, has its root, has its origin in Judaism. And how it relates to the Jews doesn't just affect our fate, but actually says something about who they are, who they are going to be, and how they are going to move forward in the world. And so I don't know who the next pope is going to be. The betting markets are active. But I will say is that the fact that this matters in a good way, that we actually have a chance of having a pope with whom we can relate, we can dialogue, where we can see each other as neighbors, as equal, is a blessing that millennia of rabbis would have felt very blessed to have. Shabbat Shalom.